Welcome, greetings, everyone. Glad to have you back. If this is your first time, glad to have you for our Facebook Live series this month. Actually going through and celebrating AAPI Heritage Month, just celebrating the wonderful people that have come from those places and that heritage. And I'm so glad and delighted, big smile on my face to actually have my friend, Reverend Lauren Ng, with us, who is Director of Leadership and Empowerment at the American Baptist Home Mission Society. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you, Charles. Good to see you, and thanks for the invitation from you and BJC.
Yes, you were one of the first people I thought of. I was like, we got to have her on and have this conversation. For those of you that haven't been with us before, we did something similar to this during Black History Month, where we had our Voices of Black Faith Freedom. And so this month's theme for the next 3 weeks is Voices of Asian American Faith Freedom. And so we're going to just jump right into it and have a good time and learn some things today, some serious topics, but also some things that we can just celebrate during our conversation. So first question I have for you, Lauren, is sort of your family story. Give us a little background of that, and how did you come to the Baptist church, if you will?
One of the things I love about these questions you give me is that it actually gives me an opportunity to do a little bit of my own family research and storytelling. So I'm coming into this call from Northern California, where I live with my husband, our 3 kids. I've been a resident of California for about 20 years, but originally was born in southeastern Pennsylvania. But your question about how did I come to the Baptist church, I came through it via my dad's family story. So my dad's father, my grandfather, was working in Boston as in the Chinese laundry when he enlisted in the U.S. Army during World War II. And when he returned from the war, in gratitude for his service, he was given citizenship, U.S. citizenship, and along with many of the other returning GIs at the time. And so it was First Baptist Church of Boston, which happens to be the 4th oldest Baptist church in America, founded in 1665, that served as a sponsoring agency for these families of these Chinese veterans who were hoping to come to America. So it was my dad's mother and my dad's older brother who came to the United States in 1947 via some time in detention on Angel Island. And because of that connection, the First Baptist Church of Boston started to have what they call Chinese Sunday school on Sunday afternoons. And my dad recalls that it was a woman named Florence Archibald, who was the superintendent, who would stand outside on Sundays and ring a bell. And all of the Chinese American neighbors and families would come together. They would study and read the Bible and learn English as a result of that. And so my dad and his 3 brothers, they and all the other children began to attend this Chinese Sunday school. And by the time my dad was in the Baptist Youth Fellowship, BYF, the church was primarily made up of Chinese American youth. So I asked my dad, when did you feel the call to ministry? And he said, while he was a high schooler, the pastor at First Baptist noticed his dedication, offered my dad a job, $10 a week, to be what was called the church school developer. And he would ride a school bus on a Sunday around Boston and pick up and accompany all these little kids. They would come to the Chinese Sunday school. While the other worship was happening, he would be leading these children through children's worship, arts, crafts, games, and the like. And then he'd get back on that bus and he would accompany all those kids back home. And so that was his first church job at First Baptist Church Boston. And then he attended Gordon College. He attended Andover Newton for seminary. He served as a youth pastor at First Chinese Baptist Church in San Francisco, where my membership currently resides. And then went on to serve for 20 years at what was then called Educational Ministries in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where the American Baptist churches are headquartered. And I guess the rest is history. I interned at American Baptist churches as a youth and was very involved, and now have the blessing of serving on national staff.
Oh wow! So you You're just Baptist born and bred.
Literally, reason why I was born in Pennsylvania is because of American Baptists. Yes.
Oh, wow. What a great story. And, even the connection with your father and, just thinking about military service. And, I have to compare backgrounds and stuff. My dad was in the military as well. We just got so many connections that we have here. You guys, you're going to hear about a lot of our connections because we just connect in that way.
We do.
But it's great. But so your dad, to even think about the fact that, the First Baptist Church of Boston and just would say, hey, you know what? Hey, we think that you'd be great to, be in this role. And then have your father go around and pick up people to come to church. And if that's not a Baptist thing, I don't know what is. This is Baptist as can be. So with that though, how do you think that your identity and maybe even if you think about your dad, but mostly you, how do you think that has informed your theology? In the Baptist tradition, I tell people all the time, the only reason I'm Baptist is because of religious freedom. And so it's the only reason I claim it in that way. But how do you think, or is there a connection between, your cultural identity or your identity and your faith? And how does that inform your faith?
I mean, I think the short answer is it's inextricable. But we spend our whole lives, don't we, processing that and unpacking that and seeing just how it's connected. Your question reminded me of a class I took in seminary at Berkeley School of Theology. And it was a class on Asian American theology. And I remember writing a song, because I'm a songwriter, but I remember writing a song that was explicitly kind of dealing with my racial and ethnic identity. And then I recall another classmate leading us through, and this was for, the creative project in the course. I recall another classmate leading us through the sacrament of the Lord's table using Japanese mochi and cups of tea.
Okay.
And so, I think in the course of the class, the primary objective was for us to sort of like carve a path or a stream of a uniquely Asian American theology or ecclesiology. But when I think back to that class, I recall feeling a sense of grief, like being kind of grief stricken, frustrated, at least for me, because it was as if we were despairing that we didn't seem to have an expression of faith or an ecclesiology that felt like it was born from us, owned by us. So it felt a little bit forced and unauthentic at the time. And then that led me to think, Charles, about my training as a writer, because I'm a creative writer, I'm a poet. Mm-hmm. And I'm reading this book now by Kathy Park Hong called Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning. She happens to have graduated from the same college and creative writing program as I did at Oberlin College in Ohio. Wow. And she talks in her book about how writers of color are often subjected to or trained in a pedagogy of kind of like a white dominant distaste for identity politics is kind of how she puts it. We joke in creative writing circles that, you're never supposed to write about, rainbows, cigarettes, coffee, or sunsets. Too cliche, but you're also taught not to write, like to, as Kathy Park Hong says, to scrub ethnic markers from your writing. Thankfully, my program at Oberlin College didn't teach that, but many creative writing programs do or did. So Asian American writers, Asian American Christians, Asian Americans in general, I think, we inherited a white dominant erasure of racial identity that can lead to racial self-hatred. When you're subjected to a white dominant Christianity, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are often not invited or encouraged to bring our identity into the mix. And if we are invited, it's often in token form. Excuse me. I have an example of that, which is when, as a member of First Chinese Baptist Church in San Francisco, Chinatown, our choir was invited to sing at a national gathering. And the invitation to us was to come in our ethnic dress. And we are primarily second generation, third generation Asian American. And so we were joking. I remember us joking and saying, well, maybe we should show up in yoga pants and North Face puffy jackets, right? That's our ethnic dress, being NorCal. So,
right.
So, examples like these are harmful, like diminishment and objectification of AAPI cultures that I think translates our ethnicity into, entertainment value, ethnic tourism, or simply to help white dominant Christianity check their multicultural box, right? So I'd say that having experienced all this and more as an Asian American Pacific Islander woman, I am part Polynesian as well as Chinese. Okay. I would say that my identity is shaping my theology, and that while I may have at some point, I no longer tolerate an understanding of God that engages in ethnic scrubbing, cultural erasure, racial self-hatred in how we seek to do and be church. I'd also say that when I think about ecclesiology, as I think back to that class I took in seminary, at the time I felt like AAPI, we were trying to carve a new path or a new stream, like I said, within the white dominant landscape. Like we were assuming that the white dominant Christianity was the foundation upon which we were trying to kind of build, right? Mm-hmm. But what I'm coming to realize now is that no, that we're actually removing layers of sediment. We're removing layers of sediment to uncover and reveal and mine for manifestations of AAPI faith that have always been there, but have been subjected to, suppression and oppression. So there's a lot there that I just gave you, but those are the intersections that I'm seeing. Yeah.
Well, the thing about it is, identity is is a broad term. Because, when I asked this question, you could go anywhere with your identity. But one of the places that you went was your identity as a writer, right? Yes. And so for me, that's a great illustration, because for somebody to try to scrub that away from you, say, no, in your writing, don't show anything about who you are, and that would be so limiting. And not only is it limiting, it makes you go back to a neutral place. And neutrality is usually where the majority is. So if the majority of Americans are white, then neutrality is going to make your story sound have whiteness to it. It reminds me of I think 60 Minutes. I don't want to put it on the wrong reporter, but one of the reporters that was interviewing the late Toni Morrison and mm-hmm. asked her, when was she going to incorporate some white people into her stories? And Toni Morrison looked at her and said, do you know how racist that question is, by the fact that you would never ask a white writer when they were going to incorporate anybody else? People don't want to be left out, and so they try to scrub things. And I think our theology does that too. Our faith tradition has done that a lot too, to say, no, we don't, there's no such thing as a race here, because the That's neutral right. is them.
I mean, think about the classes. I don't know about you, but growing up in the public school system in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I think about taking English. And as we received our syllabus with the reading list on literature, I remember doing a whole semester on American authors.
Right.
And we each got to choose one, and it was, Willa Cather, Truman Capote, all white authors. And it wasn't until I went to college at Oberlin, that I was able to take a class in queer literature, authors of color, all that kind of stuff. So it's no wonder that becomes the status quo by which all of those standards begin to be built. And so anything, rubbing ethnic markers, scrubbing them off is seen as, it's in response to what is seen as a departure from what should be standard, the norm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And so it makes me think about, BJC, thinking about faith freedom and religious freedom for all people. So how would you define faith freedom and or Asian American faith freedom? And when I say define it is maybe what would it look like, in a not even a perfect society, because everybody always say, oh, you can't be perfect. But in an ideal society, so what we should be shooting for, how would you define faith freedom?
Yeah, one of the things that I think a lot of us have heard, especially in this month of AAPI Heritage, is that Asian American Pacific Islanders are not a monolith. We're not monolithic ethnically, culturally, or religiously, for that matter. Your guests for the next two weeks, Dr. Kyati Joshi and Tahil Sharma, they'll have much more to say about these pluralities to which I'm referring, because their expertise really rests in those spaces while mine does not. But I do know that that AAPI have much to gain and lose when it comes to threats to our faith freedom in this country. Because communities of color, as we know, are historically and disproportionately targeted by those threats. So faith freedom, needs to be advocated for and fought for in all spaces, right? Both civic and religious. And as it relates to AAPI in particular, I'm reminded of out here in California, we have the California Religious Freedom Act that was signed in 2017. That prevents the federal government from using databases, right, in California to develop registries based on religion or ethnicity. And, we know that those types of practices are not only ineffective as law enforcement and anti-terrorism tools. I think in the 10 years of the NSEERS program, there wasn't a single terrorist-related conviction that came out of that experiment. But we also know that those policies are racist, they're discriminatory, and especially toward our Southern and Western Asian American sisters and brothers. So, I love what you guys say, what BJC says on your social platforms about, I think I wrote it down because I wanted to get it, like, we advocate a golden rule of religious liberty, right? Do not ask government to promote your religion if you don't want government to promote somebody else's religion. Do not permit government to hinder somebody else's religion if you don't want government to hinder your own religion. Amen. So how would I define faith freedom or AAPI faith freedom? It's non-monolithic, yet unified, a unified approach to dismantling historic, systemic, disproportionate threats to our faith freedom.
I'm glad you used what what we use at PJC. But yeah, as you was talking, Lauren, I was trying to find out a way to say this, and you've been around me enough to know that some things pop in my head, and I have to take credit for the things that I say, not because I think I'm smart, but because I only want to get myself in trouble.
well, and let's look at your mug, right? I mean, you showed me your mug, and yes, you might want to show everybody your mug.
Of course, I talk to myself.
Sometimes I need expert advice. Okay, Charles Watson Jr.
So funny.
What do you have for us?
Even with saying that, and you were saying it so many times when I was doing the Voices of Black Faith Freedom, we are not a monolith. We're different. Exactly. You say the same thing.
Yeah.
And for years, I've been trying to figure out why certain groups can't understand that. And again, this is me. I think people understand it, but they don't understand it until it's about them. And I'll try to say it in this way. There used to be, I don't know if it was a joke or a saying that I heard one time. And when it came to employment with Black individuals, and when you have a group of the thing with white men in a room, they don't become white until a Black person walks in. Before that Black person walks in, oh, my family's from Germany, my family's from London, my family's from Italy, my family's from these places. But once the unification of something that's different comes in, then now they're unified. But so you understand that people are from different places and have different cultures and have different things that are actually helpful to society. And I wish that that was seen in all of us. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. And it leads me to, tragically, even as we're celebrating AAPI Heritage Month, we still this year have had, hate crimes
Yeah.
that have ravaged the community. And, as being African American Black, I know about those type of crimes in there. And you wrote about some of the things that happened in Atlanta, and it's kind of close to me. I'm from Georgia. I used to live in Atlanta,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you heard on my thing. My brother's mom is Filipino, so that kind of gives me a little bit of connection. But maybe there isn't a connection, maybe there is. But what role do you think religion played? Maybe not even in the attacks, or what role did you see religion play after the attack? So either one of those.
Yeah.
In that.
Yeah. Yeah. So great question. The thing that you're referring to, Charles, is something that I had reflected on and ended up becoming a Facebook, a social media post. It was in response to the fact that literally the hours after Robert Aaron Long murdered, took the lives of so many people in the Atlanta area on March 16th. That in those hours following those horrific murders, there was already the chatter, right, on the news and in the news media coverage and social media of, well, what was the reason? Let's not jump to the possibility that it was racially motivated or biased hate crime, but he seems to be claiming sexual addiction. Mm-hmm. And I think what I ended up posting that day was something along the lines of, I don't care if the women were excuse me, my dog is barking in the back. I was hoping that he doesn't bark all day. And then the second picture on Facebook Live, off he goes. I remember thinking, that to even be having that question, like, it doesn't matter if the women, what the women did for a living. Race is always part of the equation. I think that's what I said. And then I said, no motive exists in isolation. Mm-hmm. So I refuse to accept the murderer's claim of sexual addiction as an isolated motive, removed and disengaged from the issue of race. And so I think in the same way, I don't believe it can be removed or disengaged from the issue of religion either. We know that humans are complex beings, right? I mean, we're an amalgamation of all types of diverse identities and narrative streams wrapped up into a single person, right? So we're constantly making calculations, assumptions, presumptions, and decisions based on these worldviews that are shaped by the primary influencers in our lives, right? And so that has to include any faith communities that we belong to. So we know that Long that the murderer was a baptized member of Crabapple First Baptist in Georgia, Milton, Georgia. And I can only speculate. I've never visited the church. I don't know anybody at the church personally, but many have speculated that evangelical purity culture had a role to play. Long admits to trying to eradicate, what or who he saw as the source of his sexual temptation. And we know that purity, the same purity culture, is damaging in the way that it places the culpability on women as provokers of male lust. Mm-hmm. It's also dangerous because it teaches this toxic theology that that sin is an immovable, unremovable stain from which we can never rid ourselves, right? And I think that recently it's been reported that the church has removed him from their membership rolls, which is an interesting decision in and of itself. Says something about theology as well, and that's another conversation for another time. But so I think that so it's all related. The onus is on faith communities in this instance, specifically on Christian communities, to recognize and wrestle with that intersectionality of the various streams of identity that make us who we are, and lead us to the decisions that we make. And so we can't parse sexuality from race, from religion, right? They need to be explored and tended to together intersectionally. So, not only does that help us avoid some of the traps that we fall into with, for instance, claiming and accepting this ridiculous notion of a singular motive, but it also helps us to see each other and treat each other more holistically, I think. I mean, there's a positive side to that as well. Yeah. So yeah, it definitely plays a part.
And I love how you say you can't separate those three things. I say the same thing we say Mother Emanuel Church in Dillon Roof. Like, you can't separate those things. It's a religious thing. There's a role that was played in that. There's a race element to it, and then there's the Christian nationalism idea and identity that is a part of it. So all of that plays in. And like I say, if your words were powerful, and I remember reading them and just were touched by your words. And I hope we don't have to, even though you're a powerful writer, I don't want you to have to write about that again. I don't want that. I don't want that happening. So I hope even these conversations like this, I hope that people can, see how similar we are, and even our differences, how valuable our differences are. And it's a beautiful thing. So the last question I'll ask you is, I ask everybody that joins us, what can America learn from Asian Americans about faith freedom?
Yeah. It's a great question, and a broad one, and a challenging one, because it's so broad, Charles. So I'm going to take a page from my own, preaching about non-monolithic community, and I'm going to say that I'm not going to try to attempt to speak for others. So I'm going to share from my own experience as a Chinese American Pacific Islander Christian woman. So the two things that I thought I would share about are othering and ownership. Okay, and the two are closely linked. So othering, faith freedom, let's talk about it even just within the Christian context, means allowing for and celebrating diverse approaches to how we practice our faith. There's a great book published by Judson Press called Streams Run Uphill: Conversations with Young Clergy Women of Color. It's written by Mihi Kim Court. And she writes in there, or at least one of the writers writes in there, about the fact that Asian women tend to wear our hair long. And do you know, Charles, that I have been told before to tie my hair up in a bun or put it up in a ponytail in order to look more professional as a woman in ministry, and not be, I'm quoting here, not be a distraction. And so I have to ask somewhat rhetorically, to whom is my long hair worn down a distraction? And why? And what should they, and not me, do about that? We just talked about the motives for what happened in Georgia. And so, that any sexualization, objectification, fetishization of Asian women behind the pulpit, or sitting in the pew in front of you for that matter, point to an inherently racist, hetero, male normativity in our church culture, right? And what it says is that I, as an Asian woman, am othered to the point that I cannot be fully Asian American with my hair down and fully called as a minister of the Christian gospel at the same time. It tells me that one of those has to give. Okay. So let me share one more story about othering. There was a time that I told somebody I was Baptist, and their immediate response was Buddhist. So in that person's eyes, now don't get me wrong, Charles, you and I actually, when I go to Chinatown, I eat primarily at the Buddhist restaurants because they're vegan, like you and me. Right. So so that's great. But in that person's eyes, I could not possibly be Asian and Christian. Right? In their narrow, sort of like flattened, one-dimensional perspective of me as the other, my racial identity was indicative of my faith. In the case of Japanese Americans interned during World War II, it was synonymous with their patriotism, right? And their national loyalties, right? Mm-hmm. So that leads to my second reflection, which is on ownership. So when the person who assumed I was Buddhist realized that I had said Baptist, it was then immediately assumed that I was recently converted by most likely a white evangelical missionary. So, we talked before about, you're mentioning something before about the monolithic and versus, why can't people see that? And there's a very famous TED talk that everyone who knows me knows that if I'm facilitating any kind of group session with you, I will show you this TED talk with the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who talks about the danger of a single story, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think I've watched it 100 times. I love it. So she talks about the danger of the single story, and that the problem is that it's not that stereotypes are untrue, it's that they're incomplete.
Right,
so,
right.
So because of the fact that generations of Asian Christians were in fact led to the Christian faith by white missionaries, not untrue, there continues to be a persistent incomplete narrative, right? That all Asians owe or must continue to owe our faith legacy to the white church. But as you've already heard from your first question, my faith was passed down to me by my Chinese mom and dad.
Right.
And on my mom's side, it was passed down to her by her Chinese mom and dad, who were actually a famous Christian author and a pastor of a Chinese megachurch in New York City, respectively.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I have is, when do we as Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, finally get to own our own faith legacy? When do we claim that legacy is coming from within our own communities?
Mm-hmm.
So othering and ownership, accept and celebrate, don't just accept and celebrate the ways AAPI bring diversity of approach and interpretation to our faith practices. If you have a problem with any of it, look inward.
Right.
Start there. Start there with my long black hair. And don't flatten our identities and experiences, because we are, as you and I both said, we are not a monolith. You can make no accurate presumptions about anyone just by looking at them. And watch us as we write our own stories of faith legacy. Learn from us, because we are not miniatures or replicas of other people's experiences. We are carving, we are removing the sediment, and we are carving faith identities of our own. So
great.
Othering and ownership.
So great. Love it. Love it. Just seeing us as assets. I love it. The value in all of us. And so, man, I wish we could even continue longer. I'm sure we're going to have more conversations. And real quickly, Lauren and I met because he was in Chicago when we first met, correct? And
Yes.
I brought my food, and she was like, the only people to bring their food are vegan, so you must be. And we came over, and that's how we became friends and talking. Yes. And I look forward to sharing another meal with you soon. I want to thank you for joining me and being our first guest on this. And for those who have joined us, I hope you come back next week, May 20th at 1:30. We have Dr. Kayati Joshi joining us, and she's going to answer the question, how do minority religions gain equality in the face of Christian privilege? I have her book here, so we'll be going over this, White Christian Privilege, next week. And also, just another BJC announcement. We want to make sure that you, if you haven't already, go ahead and sign up for our Fierce Freedom event. That's going to be on June 8th at 1 p.m. Reverend Jackie Lewis is going to be the speaker for that day before Juneteenth. So please join us for that. I think it's going to be dropped in the link there on that, like I say, on the 18th of June. And so go ahead and register and get registered for that. So once again, Lauren, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your wisdom. Yeah. Thank you for your ministry, and thank you for your parents too. Thank you for your parents.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Charles.
All right. Well, you take care, and see you guys next time.